The implementation and just wildfire success of PIX has changed how whole parts of the economy function. I think there's going to be years of development and growth and innovation around how payments function in Brazil.
There does seem to be this very strange combination in Brazil, kind of magical combination of willing to be adventurous and try new stuff, but also like a level of trust in those things that kind of go together, and it makes for really great early adopters.
Hello and welcome to Brazil is Not for Beginners. Today I'm joined by two close friends. I'm very excited for today's podcast. We have Andrew Endicott. Andrew is one of the founders of Gilgamesh Ventures. He was a founder at Peddle beforehand. And Alex Johnson, who joined us from Fintech Takes, a podcast and newsletter empire. Alex is also my first internet friend, which I'm very excited about. I've never actually met Alex in person. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Isaac. How are you doing?
Thanks for having us.
In the interest of full disclosure here, I need to share that in addition to being dear friends, Alex and Andrew are both investors in my startup, Teddy. And so we're obligated to sing the praises throughout the podcast of what we do here. But I think the point here is to talk about fintech in Brazil. And I figured who better to talk about fintech in Brazil than three white men from random small cities across the United States. So really excited to dig into this. I think the Central Bank of Brazil has been called the best fintech in the world over the last few years. And so there's a lot to dig in here. All three of us pay a lot of close attention to it. Obviously, me building here, Andrew investing here, and Alex writing about it. But gentlemen, before we dig into fintech itself, I'd love to let you two introduce yourselves a little bit better to the audience. Andrew, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? And then Alex, it would be great to hear about you as well.
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited to do this. This is two cool people to chat with. So I've spent my career doing a variety of things, but in the last decade, it's really focused on fintech in particular. I began my career as a corporate lawyer. I'd gone to Harvard Law School, spent several years in New York doing large M&A transactions and capital markets. Enjoyed it, but figured that the law wasn't for me after a couple of years, and became an investment banker after that at Lazard.
I'm not sure which is better or worse.
Yeah, neither career really has a lot of. They're not the most enjoyable jobs when you're in them. They pay pretty well, but they're pretty rough. But I was an investment banker at Lazard for a while, working primarily in specialty finance, which was honestly really you'd call most of the companies we work with fintech companies today. They focus on lending, but non-bank lending, and working with institutions like WebBank and other issuer banks in the process. I learned a lot there. Learned enough that I thought I'd be able to start a company, and so I left Lazard in 2015 and joined with a really good friend of mine from law school, Jason Gross, to start Peddle, and Jack Arenas joined us as well, and spent the better part of the next decade building Peddle. It's a consumer-facing fintech in the credit card space, for those of you that don't know it, but really, experienced the journey of building a fintech company in the United States. So a little bit different than a lot of what we're going to talk about today, but incredible learning experience. Saw everything from, coming up with the original idea to building a team, raising capital, building the team some more, launching, raising more capital, raising debt capital, scaling, and
Building more of the team.
Yeah, exactly. All the things that follow from that. And I fell in love with fintech. I fell in love with entrepreneurship as well. And along the way, I became an investor too. I rather organically started investing kind of in the mid to late 20 teens with Miguel Armaza, who's my partner with Gilgamesh. And we'd known each other for, at that point, about a decade already. And investing over time became a more serious part of my life, and spending more and more time on it became more formal. We started Gilgamesh prior to the pandemic, and around the end of 2021, I kind of hung up my spurs as a full-time entrepreneur at Peddle and went to focus on investing full-time in fintech, really using what I learned as an operator and as somebody who'd been in the entrepreneur's seat. And so, I love fintech. I love investing with great entrepreneurs. I also just love finance. I also spend a good chunk of my, not a good chunk, but a small amount, but a meaningful amount of my time as a board member of Encore Bank in the Southern U.S., where I get to see the regulated side of finance. which is important for us to understand too, given that finance is what we're trying to innovate on. So yeah, that's me for the most part. Live in New York, spent a lot of time in Brazil where I am today. Yeah, that's me.
Great. And I want to get deeper into the Gilgamesh piece and the investing piece. But first, Alex, it would be great to hear about you. We met, like I said, we're internet friends because you started a newsletter in your spare time and I replied to it. And
Yes.
you were kind enough to reply to me and, life took it where it went.
It did. Yeah, you're like my first internet friend as well, I think actually. It's strange that we've never met in person given that we've gotten to know each other pretty well and I am an investor in Teddy, which I'm very excited about. But yeah, I've worked in financial services for coming up on 20 years now and got started working at a fintech company that was not called fintech at the time. This was like 10, 12 years before fintech even was really a term people were using. And it was kind of by accident because it was one of two software companies that was in my hometown. And I wanted to work in technology, but I didn't really know what that meant. And certainly didn't know anything about fintech, but they happened to be building software for banks to use to facilitate lending and credit decisioning. And so sort of fell into that world. Spent about 12 years at that company, which was bootstrapped and built their own cloud computing environment because this was before AWS. So I think all the lessons I learned about fintech are no longer applicable to how fintech works today. But that was my background, kind of learning about the space.
Alex, what was that company
It's
called?
a company called Zoot Enterprises, and they're still around. They're just a couple miles down the road from where I am now, and they were one of the pioneers, honestly, of cloud-based credit decisioning and loan origination software. But it was just so happens that at the time they were not able to sell their fintech infrastructure to other fintech companies, which I think is much more common today. And so by default, they had to sell it to banks. I mean, there was no like sort of VC ecosystem that could kind of nurture these infrastructure companies. And so they got thrown right into the deep end of the pool. I think their first customer was Wells Fargo. And so they had to sort of negotiate and get through all of those kind of big bank procurement processes from day one. But you learn a lot going through all of that, and in addition to getting learn about financial technology, I also got to learn kind of Andrew, as you were saying, about kind of the mechanics of banks and how they work as well, and sort of fell in love with both topics. It's weird to tell people that I write full time about fintech and financial services and banking now because most people look at me like I've lost my mind. But if you've spent enough time in this industry, you can sort of find the fascinating parts of it and get obsessed with it. And that's been my journey. And so when I left Zoot, I spent a couple years as a market research analyst focused on the credit card space, where I briefly lived in Boston. And Isaac deepened my love of the Boston Celtics as a sports team that I follow, which continues to today. And then spent a few years at
As long as you're not a Pats fan, my friend.
no, no. The Pats thing never took hold. They were like kind of too cool at the time. So it felt like too much like jumping on the bandwagon. The Celtics were good, but they weren't like that good. So I am not, nor am I a Red Sox fan. So I feel like I'm safe. But had that experience and then went to FICO, the credit scoring company, for a few years. And again, got to get like a very in-depth up close look at Andrew, I think a lot of the same things you guys were looking at when you were at Pedal, like how credit scoring works, how the credit bureaus work, how lending works, and very, very educational. And towards the end of my time at FICO, right around the pandemic and Isaac, when we started to become friends, I started Fintech Takes as a little side project, and it quickly grew into my favorite thing to do every week. I think Isaac, actually, we became friends because you responded to some of my subtle pop culture references to terrible movies from the 80s that I would sort of sneak into the newsletter. And, it just became like a really
Sounds about right.
fun. Yeah, I don't remember which one it was. Die Hard, maybe it was maybe the first one. Not a terrible movie, the best movie ever made.
It's a
And
Christmas movie, right?
I will die on that hill. It is absolutely a Christmas movie. And yeah, eventually was able to transition to writing the newsletter full time, which I've been doing for the last couple of years.
Awesome. I love both of your journeys, and I think we're going to have a really fun conversation here and nerd out on fintech. And Alex, your job here, especially as we talk about Brazil, where I think Andrew and I are deep in the weeds to make sure that somebody who doesn't know Brazil well is going to understand what's going on. So
I'll ask the dumb questions, no problem.
that's your specialty, my friend. I want to go deeper into the investing piece and how you, as a builder in New York, came to invest in Brazil. So a little bit on the personal side, connecting with Miguel, who is my podcast rival here. So we've got to make sure we get a couple of digs into him while we're on this. But how did you end up looking at Brazil? What attracted you to the market, and how did you build Gilgamesh?
Yeah, so there's probably some backstory required for some of this, because it's just from the outside, it's probably not obvious why I'm spending a lot of time in Brazil and South America investing. From my standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. But like a lot of people, I've paid attention to Brazil for a long time. I think going back to being a kid, watching the World Cup, seeing Brazil being extremely good, that was probably the beginning. But kind of more recently, I went to the University of Arkansas for college, and there's a very peculiar kind of historical event that happened. I think at some point in the 60s or 70s, but there was a guy who went to the University of Arkansas, and he was from Bolivia. So he went to the University of Arkansas, graduated, went back to Bolivia, and after one of the changes in administration, which I think there were quite a few in Bolivia back at that point, he became the Minister of Education. And I don't really know what he accomplished or didn't accomplish as Minister of Education, but I do know that he put together a treaty, or some other agreement between the state of Bolivia and the University of Arkansas, such that any Bolivian national, as long as they met the admission standards to go to the University of Arkansas, would be eligible for in-state tuition. And so,
Fascinating.
That is awesome. The Bolivia to Arkansas pipeline is fantastic.
yeah, there's a lot of jokes you can make about Bolivia and Arkansas being somewhat similarly situated, just on different continents. I won't get into that, but the upshot is when I was in college, I got to know a lot of folks from Bolivia. One of which was now a really good friend of mine named Patricio Rodriguez. And if you fast forward quite a few years, I'd graduated from law school after having also been in Boston for a good number of years. Moved to New York, and my friend Patricio Rodriguez from college from Bolivia moved to New York as well. And Miguel Armaza, my partner with Gilgamesh, had gone to high school with Patricio in Bolivia. So, long story short, my social life over the last decade and a half have been relatively immersed in kind of the Bolivian New York social scene, which is unique and interesting. And that's kind of an important context. And if you fast forward to my time at Pedal, there was a period where we were kind of thinking big picture, looking at opportunities to expand the business, either through expanding our product suite, or looking to other markets. And we had a real discussion about potentially doing some things outside the United States. And I took that on my plate. And Miguel had been an investor in Pedal at the time. And so, he and I kind of collaborated to fill out that idea that Pedal could potentially grow outside the boundaries of the United States. And so we had a lot of conversations with people outside the U.S., mainly in Latin America, mainly in Mexico and Brazil. And notably, the main conversation we had in Brazil was with Pedro Conrades, the CEO of Neon. And I think at that time, his business was just getting started. And I was kind of collecting intelligence on the market and getting to know what was going on. And really, that conversation and just a series of conversations that flowed from that, just underscored how rapid the growth in fintech really was in Brazil. Just adding hundreds of thousands of customers a month and growing at a rate that I think even compared to the United States was, almost exponential.
Did you come down to Brazil at that time, or you did it more virtually?
It was a little bit later. It was all virtual at that point, but not tremendously later. I think it was like a year later or something like that. But that kicked off a lot of curiosity on my side, and this is when we were kind of putting together the foundations of Gilgamesh before it was begun. And Miguel had been spending a big chunk of his working career outside the U.S., a lot of it in Latin America, and it was just very natural that we put Brazil really at the center of the thesis, just seeing the successes with Nubank, with XP, with PagSeguro, and with other companies that today are still very successful IPOs that in kind of the last generation of fintech have emerged and done really well. That was apparent several years ago that was happening, and there were other conditions that we'll talk about, I'm sure, kind of on this in this conversation about just favorable regulatory conditions with the Brazilian central bank. Really kind of a market that is huge, and has the capacity to absorb a lot of supply of financial services, but currently that isn't happening. And so seeing those things as Gilgamesh was taking off was a really obvious thing for us to do.
So I love that you did real research before coming down here. When did you first come to Brazil? What were your expectations for coming, and what were your impressions getting here? Both, I guess, on a personal level, on a business level, and then on a fintech investing level.
Yeah, during the pandemic, I think is when I made my first trip. I think it was in 2020. It may have been in 2021. I don't remember exactly when. But
Flights were cheap then.
yes, flights were very cheap, much more expensive now. In terms of what I expected, I think anytime you go to a new country, it's kind of hard to know exactly what to expect, right? But I think I expected it to be big. I expected to encounter really sharp people doing interesting things. But I think what I would say is that in so many ways, Brazil is so much bigger than you think, in almost every sense of the word. Geographically, it's huge. There are all kinds of crazy relations that, Eastern Brazil is closer to Africa than it is to Western Brazil, and Northern Brazil is closer to Canada than it is to Southern Brazil. All kinds of ridiculous dimensions of the geography of Brazil. The culture is huge. There's a tremendous amount of diversity. Everybody's speaking the same language, but there's a lot of very different things going on. But most importantly for this, I think the economy is huge. You've got very large industries, very diverse industries that there's not, I think Brazil does a lot of things very well. And so understanding that side of it was something that, really took time, and was, the moment you land and you start talking to people, that becomes obvious that you're gonna have to really lean in to figure it out. And really germane to this discussion, the fintech community and the degree of innovation happening here, I think is the innovation feels deeper than in the United States. First of all, the community probably is not just on a sheer numbers, basis bigger, but it feels bigger sometimes because it's mostly concentrated in Sao Paulo. And so everything relating to fintech, everything relating to kind of the innovation economy here is extraordinarily deep. And that's something that every time I come back, I'm kind of blown away by just how far you can go down the rabbit hole. And there are new rabbit holes being dug all the time with PIX, with Drex, with open banking, with all the innovations coming out of the Brazilian central bank, that are truly incredible, and kind of it blows your mind how nuanced the thinking that's going into these things really is. But it's creating a huge amount of opportunity, and it's really tough to get up to speed every time one of those changes happens, and get up to speed with what people are doing.
So, Alex, you've never been to Brazil, to the best of my knowledge of our relationship. We're working on it. We're trying to get you down here.
I would have stopped by and knocked on your door. That's like my first stop when I come to Brazil. So you would know. You will know when I show up.
I will
That's
make sure the beer is cold. But
I
I guess
appreciate that.
how, obviously you're investor in Teddy, and we catch up regularly about what we're working on.
Yeah.
And as a fintech influencer, I don't know if that's the right term for what you do. How has your expectations of Brazil and your understandings of it changed over the years that you've been doing this, and kind of how are they, aligned with what Andrew's talking about? Like I said, I've heard to the Brazilian central bank called the best fintech in the world, or the most successful fintech in the world, and there's really amazing things going on. And
Yeah.
and from an outsider perspective, how do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? Because I just want to think that America is exceptional in all ways, including fintech. But it's hard to argue with Andrew's point, right, about the depth of sort of fintech in Brazil being as deep or deeper than it is in the US and really almost anywhere else that I've seen in the world. And the level of support at the central bank and at other sort of parts of the economy for fintech to really flourish there, it is unique from everything that I've seen. And I have become kind of obsessed with it, particularly as we've started kind of working together more and spending more time talking about what you're building with Teddy. Just because I've gotten really fascinated with what are the conditions that make for a really ripe environment for fintech to take off, right? And it's not always what you would think or the combination of things that you would think, right? So a lot of times I get in trouble sometimes with my friends in Canada, as an example, because I'll sort of lament the sad state of fintech in Canada. And it's not because there aren't great entrepreneurs focused on fintech living in Canada trying to make it happen. There absolutely are. And it's not necessarily because banks in Canada are incredible and everyone is just totally satisfied with what they get from the big five banks in Canada and there's no need for any innovation. That's not really true either. But there's some other sort of constraints around the concentration of the market, the size of the market, the level of sort of VC interest in the space, the role of regulators and sort of regulatory capture. And all of those things seem to sort of conspire in Canada and even in like the UK, which has had a lot of successful fintech, but maybe not as much as you would think, or Australia or wherever. Um, those things tend to sort of hold it back. And while I think the US is much more successful in that respect, we still have some of those limitations. Like to build off your point about the central bank, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is how much further would we be in the US in terms of adoption of real time payments and Fed Now if the Federal Reserve had built their own sort of front facing consumer experience, right? And we didn't do that. The Federal Reserve treats its role in the US as solely infrastructure that's optional to use. And we could use a little bit of a stronger lever to kind of push some of those things forward. We're going to see a similar, I think, kind of inching forward on open banking, but it's probably not going to be as sort of aggressive and assertive as it needs to be. So, I mean, I would turn this question back to you guys, but like, what is it about Brazil, which, as I understand it, has some of these same characteristics, like relatively concentrated banking industry with a lot of sort of incumbent power that people aren't necessarily thrilled with, but also wouldn't be necessarily that supportive of like disruption or innovation. What is it about Brazil uniquely that allows fintech to flourish there? Because I become obsessed with that question, but I don't know that I've ever quite put my finger on the answer either.
Yeah, I think my point of view, it's a lot of the stuff you made reference to.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some really kind of just abstract ideas. I mean, necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah.
Creativity thrives within constraints. If you look at Brazil, I think everybody here would admit, very readily that, at least several years ago, and including today, the financial system is very far from perfect.
Yeah.
You've got really bad outcomes for a lot of people, and there's a very deeply felt need to do things differently. There's a sense that the traditional financial system serves a very small, cross section of society,
Mhm.
and you have those same opinions in the U.S., but they're not as severe.
Yeah.
So I think that's one big thing, and so I think there's more attention, more effort put into coming up with solutions, and you don't have to go very far to find that. Look at Nubank and look at kind of what they replaced, and you'll immediately see where there's low hanging fruit.
Mhm.
There's low hanging fruit everywhere.
Mhm.
The other thing, you mentioned the concentration in the banking system. I think that part is really important because it motivates another thing that's really important, which is the regulatory community, to be very proactive. And so I don't know the stats off the tip of my tongue, but the banking system in Brazil is very largely kind of concentrated in a pretty small number of hands.
Mhm.
And that's scary to the regulators. If you think about systemic risk, if you think about the health of your economy writ large, you're really worried that one or two dominoes fall and the whole thing just collapses. And so there's a lot of interest in creating alternatives, financial alternatives, kind of new entrants to the financial system. And I think I agree with this statement that nobody really sees a way to do that outside of technology enabled solutions.
Yeah.
And so they're very proactive and very friendly for encouraging those things, and they create these platforms, these infrastructure to make it happen. And so I think the last thing is, Brazil's just very big. Like I said earlier, it has the ability to attract investment, it has the ability to attract talent.
Yeah, there's a density to it, right? That I think is also kind of missed, right? I mean, again, I love the UK, but like it's a small little island, right? I mean, like it's not that big, and so
Right.
maybe this touches on like VC interest in Brazil specifically, but like there does seem to be something about the size of Brazil correlated with those other factors that you mentioned, where it's like, oh, if we invest in this and it turns the way we think it could, which obviously Nubank and others have demonstrated, we could drive like a profound amount of disruption in this market. Whereas I think a lot of other markets, just the size of it sort of limits the potential upside.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Yeah, and I think, Alex, we've talked about it, and I want to kind of continue to push on this same point. At Gilgamesh, you guys do in the Americas, right? So you're fintech across the Americas. How does Brazil differ from the other countries? And we've talked about this a little bit, and you guys just brought it up now. I think one of the unique things about Brazil is you can build a unicorn just in Brazil. 220 million people. It just got back to be one of the 10 biggest economies in the world.
Yeah.
You don't have to immediately think about scaling across borders or going into another market to reach demand. There's sufficient demand in Brazil. Andrew, you said it's big. I mean, I felt the same way the first time I came to Brazil, seeing the size of the country, the extent of the cities, how they extend, the wealth when you go to some of these beach resorts and the helicopters flying above you, and just the scale of what's going on here. And so going a little bit deeper and kind of looking at this in comparison to some of the other markets you look at, how is Brazil different? I think you touched on some of the points, but if there's anything you want to go deeper on?
Yeah. So as a fund, we're really investing in three primary geographies. We invest in the United States. Don't have to explain. People everywhere understand why you would invest in the U.S. It's the biggest financial market in the world, and it's a great place to invest for a lot of reasons. Brazil, as we just said, it's big enough to support IPOable companies. There's a lot of examples of this. The population is large. The economy is large. It's growing at a good clip. There's kind of dynamism. I think that's maybe a good word here. We talk about American dynamism. Well, I think the Brazilian dynamism is a thing, and it's you have a willingness and a desire to kind of tear down the old, put up the new, and put it up better than it was. And that's entrepreneurs, that's business people, that's regulators. I think it's just the people, the citizenry. I think they believe in doing that. And then the third place we invest is Spanish-speaking LATAM generally, which the center of gravity for that is Mexico. And it's got some of the same conditions as Brazil, but it's different in some important ways. I think generally speaking, the U.S. is perceived as being the most advanced country or market in fintech. Brazil is right there with it. Some ways ahead of it, arguably a couple ways behind, but in a lot of ways, I think they have parity. Spanish-speaking LATAM is some number of years behind. And so, it's kind of earlier in the curve of financial technology development. And, as investors, what that means is that we can really take learnings that we've been able to develop in the United States and Brazil, and to pass those along to entrepreneurs or to otherwise apply them in those markets. And, the Mexico generally is, we believe, big enough to support huge companies on its own. But it's also not terribly difficult to move from Mexico to some of those nearby markets, or those nearby markets to Mexico. But I think the main defining thing is you're not quite as caught up on the development. And that, for us as investors, that means we can get in earlier with ideas, with kind of trends and so on. So we're very excited about that market as well. And we're, in a general sense, we're kind of evenly allocated between the U.S., Brazil, and Spanish-speaking LATAM. But I think Brazil is, given the combination of things we talked about earlier, it's just very exciting, given that depth, given that attention paid to doing new things. It's setting the pace. It's really out in front. Whereas you see Spanish-speaking LATAM, sometimes it will be, but it's more kind of, it's following some of the things that are being created in Brazil or in the United States. They're all very, very attractive markets, but they're a little bit different.
Can we double click just into the point about dynamism for a second? Because I thought that was very interesting, and I agree with that statement, and it kind of makes me think about, again, picking on other countries that are sort of different in this respect. And I'll go back to Canada just because they don't like me anyway, so we might as well do that. One thing I've sort of heard from folks in that market, and pops up in other markets where you don't see quite as much disruption, is there's almost just like a level of kind of acceptance from consumers. Like, this isn't great, but it's fine. And I don't really want to like disrupt anything or try anything new. Like, this just kind of like not almost culturally like who they are. And you see that in consumers, you see it with levels of interest in entrepreneurship, and like, do they have like entrepreneurship hubs like a Sao Paulo or San Francisco or wherever? And you see it even, like, to your point, Andrew, on the regulatory side, with like how aggressive and innovative regulators want to be versus more like sort of protecting the status quo, or sort of just focused on like safety and soundness. And again, I do think Brazil is rather exceptional across those levels. But having never been there, I guess I'm curious, like, what is it culturally or just in what you observe about the people in Brazil that you think contributes to that? Because it does remind me in some ways of the US, maybe even more so in some ways. And it also seems rather exceptional compared to a lot of other countries where you might expect to see more fintech innovation.
So, Alex, you keep stealing my questions.
That's my specialty.
Yeah, you've obviously been doing this podcasting before, but just to add a little bit to what Alex said, Andrew, you built a large consumer-focused fintech in the U.S. and now work with lots of, I think, more B2B, but also some B2C companies across Latin America. Adding to what Alex talked about there on the dynamism, how is working with entrepreneurs in Brazil, your experience of it different than in the U.S. and in other markets?
Yeah, so I'll answer some of Alex's question and kind of get to yours, Isaac. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not a sociologist. I don't know who would study this kind of thing, but I think culture has dramatic impacts on a lot of things. I
Yeah.
think it's hard to describe. The
You sort of know it when you experience it. It feels like.
Yeah, you do. But one thing I believe in is what I'd kind of describe as forward-looking and backward-looking societies. And I haven't really ever read that much about this, but I think you have for people in the United States that you can experience this in various places in the United States. I'm from the Southeast. I was born in Mississippi. I grew up in Arkansas. The feeling you get being, particularly I think the further east you go in the Southeast, you kind of feel like the orientation turns a little bit, kind of as to like whether you're looking forward or looking kind of towards history. It's not derogatory.
No,
But it's
yeah, yeah.
just your reference point is different.
Mhm.
Um, and I think if you're in a place like New York or California, you're kind of headed towards something that
Yeah.
isn't there.
Yeah.
And there are very clear kind of exceptions to all these regions, for how people do things. Like in Texas, you've got Austin, which tends to be a very
Mhm.
forward-looking city, and there's places where the states I've lived in that's the case too. But in Brazil, I think you kind of get that feeling pretty strongly that there's a future orientation,
Hmm.
and I don't know what it comes from. I think in other parts of Latin America that is not there. I would not guess that it's really a Spanish versus Portuguese kind of,
Distinction. Yeah.
I don't think that's it. It might be. There's better people to ask than me to explain it, but I think it has a real impact. That kind of idea, and everybody, not everybody, but a large chunk of society tends to look towards creating something new.
Yeah.
Not necessarily with technology, not necessarily with any given thing, but there's a bit of a building. People are building towards something.
Well, it's fascinating, right? Because like I think about that in like Nubank just taking off and people just being willing to try something that like is new, not to
Mhm.
make a pun, but like this is like a brand new thing that you've never seen before and that is very different than the experience that you have today.
Right.
But yeah, I'll try it. Or like, Pix is the same way. Like I was sort of playing.
Brazilians are great early adopters.
Well, they really are, right? I mean, that's one thing that's kind of shocking to me. I was thinking about like if I'm playing my hypothetical out, if the Federal Reserve Bank in the US introduced its own like mobile app or whatever, like people would not trust it. And I think that speaks to like a cultural difference with Americans, but like there does seem to be this very strange combination in Brazil, kind of magical combination of willing to be adventurous and try new stuff, but also like a level of trust in those things that kind of go together. And
Yeah.
it's makes for really great early adopters, Isaac, to your point.
It does. It's funny your point about the Federal Reserve versus central bank. I mean, the degree of political polarization in Brazil is pretty significant. So
Yeah,
it's
sure,
it's
right.
not that
That's not the issue, right?
everybody's not on the same page for what society should look like
Yeah,
necessarily,
yeah.
but they are on the same page with respect to like, hey, let's change some things. And
Interesting.
so,
Interesting.
yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'm going to think about it more. Maybe next year I'll have a better answer. But Isaac, you mentioned kind of the difference between working with entrepreneurs in the U.S. versus Brazil. I think just generalizing, this is something that I've noticed. I know that Miguel has talked about it some too. There does feel to be a tendency that there's an agility that entrepreneurs display in Brazil that I find fascinating and very impressive. People tend to be very fast moving. They can change direction very fast when it comes to their strategy, their business model, their what they're trying to do. If they need to pivot, they do it rapidly in a way that I think people in the United States do that as well. But it's just not quite as fast. And maybe it goes back to kind of the everything else we're talking about. I think the part of it is there's a little bit, I think, stronger survival instinct. Getting back to like you don't have quite the same social, kind of safety net in Brazil as you may have in more developed places.
There's a scrappiness, I think.
Yeah,
And I remember I was at your conference in Mexico a few years ago, and I think whoever was supposed to moderate the panel canceled, and you guys roped me into doing it. And we talked about how Latin American in general, but I think in Brazil it really is true. Startups are scrappier than in other places because there's less funding. You need to be quicker. You're fighting to survive every day. You see some companies that go out and raise big rounds and can mess around and do stuff, but generally people are raising to do something specific and they try to figure it out. And if it's not working right away, they've got to pivot or else they can't keep working.
yeah, it's true. I'm sure that there's probably some downside to that. I actually had this discussion last night with somebody that if you're willing to move so quickly and pivot and change strategy, maybe you didn't have that much kind of fidelity to your original mission, your ideas in the first place. Maybe that's true, but it is very impressive how fast people can be. And it's, as somebody who's been an entrepreneur, who's been a founder, that's really tough because you have to have the intellectual honesty, the candor with your team to say we were wrong about something, but oh, by the way, you need to also still trust me to get it right next time. There's a burden on leadership to do that well and to explain it. When you're seeing people do it effectively at that speed, that's very, very impressive.
Yeah, really cool. I want to ask you guys, we talked around it a lot, around kind of the central bank's agenda and what's happening in Brazil. What has you most excited, Andrew, as an investor? Like, what are the theses that you are really interested in? And you don't have to name the names of the companies you've invested in. I mean, obviously, feel free to mention me. But what is it about fintech in Brazil that has you excited, and maybe some specific areas that you're really looking forward to seeing how they develop in the next couple of years? And Alex, you too, as you watch it from afar, what are you looking at from the central bank or from fintechs that can set that model for potentially other markets, or just a really interesting in Brazil?
Yeah, I would say that there's the stuff that we already talked about, size of the market, great entrepreneurs. You have I think one of the exciting things about Brazil is it's kind of gotten over this hump of development and success where you've had companies succeed and then you have kind of capital returning to become angel investors and late stage employees and executives who have knowledge on how to build businesses coming back and starting companies and advising people and investing in those companies, and really kind of just priming the pump for future development. And that's something that very much has happened in Brazil because of the successes at XP and Nubank and others. So there's kind of the general stuff. To some extent, the excitement is based around some of these regulatory developments for the central bank. I mean, the implementation and just wildfire success of PIX has changed how whole parts of the economy function. I think there's going to be years of development and growth and innovation around how payments function in Brazil. We every time we're here, we meet a lot of entrepreneurs doing those things, and it's going to be unsettled for a while. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting businesses that continue to be started and developed in the coming years around that. You've got some other really exciting things, in terms of open banking here. I think it's a different model than the U.S. I think the regulatory agencies in the U.S. and in Brazil now are leaned into it. And we've had the privilege of actually talking with some of those folks in the last couple of days in Brazil. But there's a lot of pressure on the banking system to be serious about opening up data, giving access to fintechs, and sometimes just creating entirely different UIs that incorporate outside data itself as being part of what open banking means. I think that's something that doesn't exist in the U.S. The requirement to have a UI that shows external data is something that I haven't seen talked about in the U.S. So open banking is a big one.
That point on pressure is really interesting because you saw Cody not work in Mexico very well, at least initially, Cody being the faster payment system in Mexico because it wasn't required, whereas PIX worked here in Brazil. And even going back to when the MasterCard Visa acquiring monopoly was broken up in 2010 and 2013, the requirement to do that, to create interoperability, the way that the central bank is able to require people or banks to comply, and the willingness of those banks to comply is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't know the Brazilian legal system at all, but in the U.S., regulators don't have a super easy time with a lot of those things, and there's strong pushback from banks that sort of vigorously defend what they're looking at. We have a case that's in front of the Supreme Court right now that may significantly weaken sort of regulatory powers at a federal level in the U.S. and
Is that Chevron, Alex?
at Chevron, yeah. And I mean, who knows where they're going to come down on it, although I've learned not to be optimistic. But the level of sort of friction associated with regulation in the US is just tough to make some of these things happen. I mean, open banking is a really interesting parallel. And I don't know a ton. I need to look more into sort of the Brazilian implementation of open banking, but it'll be such an interesting contrast because as we've been talking about, the US and Brazil are very similar, like from a fintech perspective, from a banking perspective, from just a size of market perspective. And so you'll be able to see a very clear distinction, I think, between how open banking is implemented in either of those two environments and to what degree regulators sort of preference the interests of incumbent banks versus disruptors. And everything I know about Brazil would suggest that they will strongly preference the benefits to disruptors and people who can kind of shake up the market or change things. Where in the US, the CFPB, I think, is doing their best, but I think it's going to come out more 50-50 ish in terms of who kind of benefits from the final rules. The other one I wanted to ask about or just drill into for a second is I don't know much about Drex, but I'm kind of fascinated by it. And the reason I'm interested in it is, again, like the US, we have this sort of undercurrent of like political conservatism where we're like, don't ever let the federal government do anything. And so, like, central bank digital currency as a term scares people and probably will make it so that we'll never have that. At least if we do, it'll be dressed up as something else. In fact, I think Fed now kind of got tagged as a digital currency, even though it's not, and people like freaked out about it. So, we're not going to be anywhere close to that nearly as fast as Brazil is. But I'm curious, it seems like the Brazilian central government is viewing that as both, or a central bank, I should say, is viewing that as a sort of a retail instrument as well as a wholesale instrument, and are sort of thinking about it pretty comprehensively. Like, what's the thought on how that might play itself out?
Yeah. So Drex, there are folks that are better experts on this than myself, but I'm
Not on this podcast, there's
yeah,
not.
somewhat knowledgeable about it. My understanding is it's in the early stages of being launched right now, kind of as we speak. It's being tested,
Mhm.
in real money movement and so on. And so it's an exciting time. I think we're really on the cusp of seeing what it can do. You're right. I think there is a willingness for the public to allow the central bank to innovate again with this type of instrument.
Mhm.
One kind of digression to your point about regulatory styles between the U.S. and Brazil, and it impacts everything else we've talked about.
Mhm.
One other thing that's I think, very notable about Brazil is there's a desire, I think, that I've noticed to create regulatory clarity that does not exist in the United States.
We prefer lack of clarity, I
Yeah,
feel. Yeah.
the United States is much more inclined to kind of have this very different form of development of regulation that almost mirrors kind of how common law was created.
Mm.
Where it's through enforcement that you
Right,
kind of
like, you're not gonna know where the edge is until you fall off, and then you'll be unhappy, but the rest of us will know where the edge is, yeah.
exactly. And so
Yeah.
in Brazil, there's a much greater willingness to just go out and say what the rules are, and
Mm.
then say you've got to comply with them. We're not going to tolerate non-compliance, and they have a willingness to push the big players, the incumbents, to do it.
Mhm.
Um,
But you also know exactly where the line is. Boy, the fintech operators in the US who are listening to this are probably just, like, crying into their beers right now. That sounds
it's
amazing.
something that the United States needs to fix.
Yeah.
We've gotten in a situation where there's been serious misallocation of capital to things that are not in regulatory great spots.
Mhm.
And I won't point any of them out, but it's the lack of clarity is bad.
Yeah, yeah.
But in Brazil, you have clarity, and so the
Mm.
capital goes to these new places where like Drex. There's going to be a lot of capital going in to find cool new things to do with it, and it's clearly going to be legal.
Mhm.
You're going to have a lot of certainty as to how it's going to operate. What regulatory regime is going to support it. And yeah, Drex is exciting. I mean, it basically you're enabling what I just call smart contracts to exist on a government, kind of not control is not the right term. Adjudicated, I don't know the right word, but a government kind of,
No, yeah, but it's like, I mean, it really
Monitored.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was when I was reading about kind of in research for the podcast, and it sounds like they're almost treating it as this is going to be like parallel financial services infrastructure that people can just build on, and like consumers can interact with it, businesses can interact with it, banks can interact with it, and we're just going to sort of see what gets built here and how financial services more governed by smart contracts works. And so it's again like in a perfect world, this is I think how you would do it, where you're like, we don't know, we're not going to say we're going to switch off everything with our traditional financial industry overnight and switch to digital currencies, but we are going to run these two kind of systems in parallel, and we're going to learn how this works and where the weak spots are and where the potential benefits are. And I think the other thing, and maybe you guys can touch on this for a second, is um I'm very curious also how Brazil sort of interfaces with other countries from a financial services perspective relative to other countries, because like central bank digital currencies, the other thing it makes me think of is cross border and interfacing with other digital currencies being developed by other countries and making cross border transactions easier and potentially facilitating like digital ID. And so there's all these like jumping off points for that allow Brazil, I would think, to not just be a really sort of strong economy in and of itself, but to sort of be a hub for a broader set of sort of economic activities. So that's where my brain starts to go when I like read about Drex and kind of what they're thinking about.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of potential directions that it can go. I think there are people really seriously considering things around foreign exchange.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's going to happen. That's contemplated. That's partially why they did it,
Yeah.
I believe, and that's going to be fascinating. I mean, the talk about profit pools.
Oh yeah.
If you look at some of the largest global financial institutions, the amount of money that they're able to capture, value they're able to capture through foreign exchange and through foreign exchange related services is dramatic. And so that's a significant reallocation of winners and losers that'll happen from that. That's exciting.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other implications. You can think about things like escrow. If you're buying a big asset and you want to make sure that the title passes, well, you can program that into Drex potentially, and like a car is an example that a lot of people use. That's really interesting. But I think one of the things that most people don't know about Drex, at least outside of Brazil, is they brought the banking system into it.
Mm.
Is an important thing, because if you truly create a digital, kind of currency that anybody can kind of freely exchange without going through intermediaries, it creates some pretty big implications.
Yeah.
On some level, you're potentially undermining kind of the banking system,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
like people keep money in banks because it's safeguarded and you can move it from one bank to the other. You can give it to somebody in their bank. And so the Brazilian government knew this, and they worked with banks to where what they're rolling out doesn't threaten the banking system. It's called a wholesale digital currency as opposed to a retail digital currency. And so your Drex will actually sit at a bank, as I understand it.
Mm.
So that the banks are able to maintain deposits. Fractional reserve banking continues to work, pretty important.
Yep.
And so that's happening, so that it's not completely clear what is going to come from Drex.
Yeah, I was going to
That's
say.
what's exciting.
Mhm.
It is clear what is legal and what's not, so that's very important. We
Mhm.
know that you can use it, which is not cannot be said for large, kind of amounts of cryptocurrency world, as we've learned, at least in the United States. And
Yeah.
so I'm excited about the applications, because it's more than just moving money around. You can do things around securitization and capital markets and all this stuff that they're smart, talented people building things, from the small amount that I've observed in the last, the relatively short period of time since it's been announced, and really, on the road to implementation.
Hmm.
So I think just like PIX, there's going to be businesses built on this. They're going to be different.
Yeah.
Some of them are going to be successful. And, I hope that, like PIX, it pushes other markets like the United States to kind of embrace a little bit more innovation and new stuff.
So I definitely picked the wrong two guests to come on for a short 40-minute podcast about fintech.
Ha.
I don't think we got to half my questions. We're maybe going to have to do a second parter at some time soon to go deeper on all these things. Lots more to talk about. But again, we want to keep this reasonable for folks that are listening. And I also want to make sure, Andrew, you have a moment to get your dig in at Miguel and his podcasting skills. But maybe before we get to that, I always ask my guests, the name of this podcast is Brazil is Not for Beginners. And I'm sure you as a foreigner have been told that many, many times, Andrew, since you've been coming down here. What does that expression mean to you?
I thought about this a little bit, and I think it's true. I think about the statement the same way that, like the NBA is not for beginners either. This is a large, sophisticated economy that has been developing to a large degree on its own. Brazil's pretty far from a lot of other big economies. It's a center of gravity. It's been developing on its own for a long time. It has very unique institutions. It has very unique markets. There's different things happening here that for an outsider, when you come in, you may think you kind of know what's going on, but you likely don't. And that is combined with, I think, a uniquely ambitious and resourceful population of people that, you can see this in the United States. People that move from Brazil to the United States and start companies tend to be pretty successful. And the population that doesn't leave is extremely good at doing things. And so you have to approach doing business in Brazil with a healthy level of respect for kind of who not your adversaries are, but who your competition is and who you're going up against if you're trying to win at what you're doing. That's something I've learned, and I think that's exciting. I also think the opportunity is huge. So, there's a lot of energy and effort going into it. The rewards are potentially very large. You can do really well if you do it right in Brazil. And so that's how I view it. I think there's just a high bar. It's not a place for amateurs.
That's the expression. And then one last piece here, because we've talked about how we need to get Alex down here at some point. And so my last question is always, is there an expression or a cultural trait that you've picked up on since you've been coming down here that you're fascinated by, that stands out, that's uniquely Brazilian? I talk about, for instance, when my wife was pregnant, that her stomach didn't belong to her. It belonged to everybody. People would just come up, touch her stomach without her asking, which is very weird to an American, but Brazilians love babies and love pregnant women. So just part of the culture.
Yeah, there's a ton of stuff. I mean, the pão de queso is everywhere, which is awesome. The food is amazing. Sao Paulo, where most people end up going, if you're doing business at least, is the biggest place I've ever been. And it's just unlike, maybe with the exception of New Delhi in India. The size is just astonishing. And there's just a lot of culture here, a lot of music, a lot of dancing, a lot of energy. I think there's an expression that the entire world could be on fire. In Brazil, people would still be having a party. And I think there's some truth to that. But that energy is not just dedicated towards having a good time. I think it goes towards everything.
Amazing.
Well, now I want to come even more than I did before.
We've got to find a sponsor for you, Alex, some sort of conference so you to come,
yes,
given a good excuse. Yes. And the third baby's big enough now, I think, that you can leave the family and come down for a solid 10 days. We're going to make it happen.
As long as you're willing to make the case directly to my wife, I'm happy to benefit from you succeeding. So let's set that up.
Happy to make that argument. I don't know how successful I'll be, but I'm definitely willing to put in the fight. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me here. How can people reach the two of you if they want to go deeper on any of the things that we brought up and all the things that we didn't because there just wasn't enough time?
Yeah, for me, my email's andrew@gilgameshvc.com. I mean, I have LinkedIn. That's also fair game. So email, LinkedIn. You can also track me down and just tap me on the shoulder too, if you want.
He's a good-looking guy for those who are not seeing the video. Yeah, for me, I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, Alex H. Johnson, and you can just Google Fintech Takes and find the newsletter and podcast, and feel free to hit reply and give me your feedback, positive or negative. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, gentlemen, really appreciate you both. If the audience doesn't follow both Alex and Andrew online, I highly recommend it. Both of them are super smart. I would never tell them that if it wasn't in this context, but I really enjoy both of your perspectives, really enjoy your friendships, and I'm really appreciative that you guys came on to talk to me today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was awesome.
Thanks again for joining us. This podcast was hosted by me, Isaac Matzner. It was produced by Amanda Villela and edited by Veronica Medina. You can find more episodes on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as on our Substack page. We love feedback, so please feel free to reach out to us on social media or via email at Brazil4beginners@gmail.com.